The Volco's apex doesn't have eyes. It hunts heat, and it tears through anything warm enough to be worth eating. They dropped me into the containment pit, 40 below dry dead air. The Galactic Council took bets on whether I'd last 10 seconds or 20. They wanted a show. They wanted a massacre. I grew up in the Siberian exclusion zone. 40 below is a mild afternoon. So when the Volcos charged, claws shredding the floor, I didn't reach for a weapon. I reached into my jacket, pulled out a standard issue thermal emitter, and slid it across the sand. The beast stopped mid-lunge, turned, ignored the fresh meat entirely, waddled over, curled around that heater like a cat on a radiator, and started making a sound I can only describe as purring. The whole council went silent. 10,000 of them, watching the galaxy's deadliest predator take a nap. They thought they were staging an execution. They didn't realize I was just bringing a blanket to a stray dog. The first thing they took was my coffee. Not my boots. Not the multi-tool in my hip pocket. Not the 40 years of terraforming certifications tattooed into a chip behind my ear. My thermos. Battered steel, dented on one side where a pressure valve blew out in 61, lid held on with a strip of vulcanized tape. The guard who took it held it at arm's length like it might detonate. "Careful with that," I said. "It's older than you." He said nothing. They didn't talk to me much. 2 of them stood outside the cell, thin, pale things, 7 feet of brittle limbs under gray robes, 4 little black eyes each. They kept looking at me and then looking at each other, and I got the distinct sense they'd expected something different. Screaming, maybe. Begging. I'd been in the cell 9 hours. Mostly I'd been thinking about how cold it was. That's the thing nobody tells you about being sentenced to death by an alien empire. There's a lot of waiting, and the accommodations are terrible. The cell ran about 4 degrees. Their idea of a hardship, to me it was a Tuesday. I grew up in the Siberian exclusion zone. Not the nice part, there isn't a nice part. My mother ran a heat exchange station out past the old Norilsk line, and by 12 I could strip a thermal regulator down to its housing with bare hands in a whiteout. Not because I was tough. Because if you didn't, the station went dark and then everyone in it went dark too. You learn to work cold. You learn that cold isn't a threat, it's a variable. So I sat there in their punishment cell comfortable and waited to find out what the actual sentence was. They came for me at what I assume was dawn, though I hadn't seen a sun in 3 weeks. The corridor opened onto a viewing platform, and that's when I understood the scale of what I'd walked into. Below me, a circular pit, maybe 200 meters across, floored in black volcanic sand. Above it, tier after tier of stone galleries, packed with thousands of them. Thin pale faces, all turned down toward the pit. Banners in deep violet and bone white hanging between the levels. The air was full of breath fog, theirs and mine. And on a raised stone box above the main gallery stood the one they called High Arbiter Vax. He was taller than the others. His robes were heavier, layered violet and white, with a rigid gold frame locked around his neck that forced his chin up at a permanent angle of contempt. When he raised his hands, 10,000 voices went quiet at once. Citizens of the Concordance. His voice carried without any obvious amplification. Good acoustics or good lungs. Hard to say. Below you stands a specimen of Homo sapiens, a species that has, for 11 cycles, described itself in our diplomatic channels as, and here he paused, letting the word sit, Deathworlders. Ripple of sound through the galleries. Not quite laughter. Something colder. They boast, Vax continued, of a homeworld that tests them. They boast of hardship. They have used this word in trade negotiations, in territorial claims, in 3 separate refusals to submit to inspection. He let his 4 eyes drift down to me. Today, the Concordance will demonstrate what a death world actually is. I'll give him this, the man could give a speech. He spent the next several minutes explaining the Volco's apex, and he didn't explain it like a warden explaining an executioner. He explained it like a priest explaining God. Native to Volco's prime. Surface temperature 280 degrees. Atmosphere thick enough to chew. The apex had no eyes. Evolution had discarded them as useless in a world of permanent ash haze. Instead it had heat pits. Hundreds of them, lining a broad flat snout, sensitive enough to resolve a living body at 400 meters through solid smoke. It hunted warmth. It found warmth. It opened warmth up. Median time to kill, across 240 recorded arena sentencings, 11 seconds. Failures, none. The galleries were wrapped. I watched Vax's face while he talked and realized something that would matter a great deal in about 20 minutes. He wasn't performing. He believed this. The apex wasn't a tool to him. It was the fixed point his whole worldview rotated around. Proof that the universe had a ceiling and his people had found it, and everyone else should be appropriately afraid. You meet men like that on job sites. They've usually got one machine they treat like a shrine. They're always the ones who don't check the manual. When he finished, the guards walked me to the edge of the drop hatch. I looked up at the box and asked the only question I actually cared about. Hey, what's the ambient temp in that pit? Vax's head tilted, 4 eyes narrowing. You are addressing the arbiter. Yeah, and the arbiter's about to drop me in a hole, so I figure we're past introductions. I nodded at the pit. The temperature. What is it? A pause. Then, from somewhere in the gallery, laughter, real this time, thin and reedy and rolling down the tiers in a wave. The doomed animal was making noise. That was the entertainment starting early. Vax indulged it. He raised one long hand and answered, and I could hear the smile in it even without lips. -31 degrees, by your scale. The chamber is chilled deliberately. His fingers steepled, so that the creature's arrival is unmistakable. I did the math. I did it twice actually, because the first time I didn't believe it. Then I said, huh, and I stopped talking, and I think that unsettled him more than anything else I could have done. The floor opened. I dropped about 6 meters and landed badly on volcanic sand, took it on the right knee, rolled, came up with grit in my teeth. Old injury, nothing new. I stood, spat, and did the 2 things any technician does when they arrive on site. I checked my breath. It fogged, hung, and fell, no updraft, no circulation. Dead air. Then I checked the walls. Rime frost, 2 meters up, thickest near the floor. -31 and dropping. Above me, 10,000 aliens leaned forward, waiting for me to scream. Across the pit, an iris hatch ground open, and something enormous shifted in the dark behind it. I heard it before I saw it, a long, low, grinding sound, like a furnace trying to turn over and failing. I stood there with my hands in my pockets, in the most comfortable weather I'd felt in 3 weeks, listening to the galaxy's deadliest predator drag itself out of its cage. And I said, to absolutely nobody, "Oh, you poor thing." It came out of the hatch sideways. That was the first thing that struck me as wrong. Predators don't come out sideways. They come out low and straight, because straight is fast and fast is dinner. This thing shouldered through the opening at an angle, dragging one flank along the wall, and it took me a second to understand why. It was trying to touch as much of the wall as possible on the way through. Then it stepped into the light, and I stopped analyzing for a moment, because it was, objectively, the most frightening thing I have ever seen. Bus-sized. 6 limbs, 4 heavy walking legs, and 2 smaller ones folded against its chest like a mantis holding something it hadn't decided to eat yet. Its whole body was armored in cracked black plate, and between the plates ran seams of magma-orange light, pulsing slow, like something enormous breathing under a crust. No eyes. Just a broad flat snout riddled with hundreds of small pits, sweeping side to side, tasting the air. Behind it, the sand it had walked across was steaming. The galleries went absolutely silent, 10,000 of them, and you could have heard a coin drop. And then the thing lifted its snout, found me, and screamed. I want to be honest about this part, because people who tell these stories always leave it out. I flinch. Not much. A quarter step back, shoulders up, the old animal part of the brain shoving the rest of me toward a wall. That's not something you train out. That's 400 million years of vertebrate hardware saying large thing, loud noise, move. The part you can train is what comes next. What comes next is, you count. I counted, 1, 2, 3, and by 3 the animal part had said its piece and sat down, and I was standing on freezing sand looking at a creature roughly the size of a public transit vehicle, and I noticed something that the flinch had hidden from me. It hadn't charged. It had screamed, and then it had stopped, snout up, weaving, casting around like a man patting his pockets for keys he's already holding. 11 seconds, Vax had said. Median time to kill. I checked my chrono. 19 seconds and counting. Up in the box, something was going wrong. I couldn't see it clearly from the floor, but I could hear it. That particular quality of noise a room makes when the person in charge asks a question he expected an obvious answer to. A ripple of movement in the viewing platform. Robes shifting. A device passing hand to hand. I found out later exactly what happened, because the concordance records everything and eventually they had to show me the record. What happened was this. Every arena sentencing runs biometric telemetry on the condemned. It's not for safety. It's for the audience. They project the readouts on the gallery walls, so the crowd can watch a heart rate climb toward its own ending. Adrenal spike, core temperature, respiratory rate, the whole physiological anatomy of terror, rendered live in violet scripts 6 meters high. Mine was flat. Not cum flat, not bray flat, genuinely boringly flat. Resting heart rate 72, core temperature nominal. Adrenal load, a small bump at the scream, already resolving. Respiration slow and even. The projection showed the numbers of a man waiting for a bus. And high arbiter Vax looked at that wall, and then down at me, and said the sentence I have since heard repeated in about 9 languages across 4 systems. The instrument is faulty. Replace it. Here is the thing about Vax that I understood before he did. He wasn't lying. He genuinely believed the instrument was broken. In his entire framework there was no available category for a warm-blooded creature standing in a killing pit with a resting pulse. The apex had never failed. Terror was not optional, it was the mechanism, the thing every species did on the way to being eaten. If the readout said otherwise, the readout was wrong. That's not stupidity. That's what certainty does to a smart person. An attendant leaned in and said, quietly, that the instrument had been calibrated 11 minutes prior, and checked twice. Vax told him to check it again. Down on the sand, I was doing something less dramatic. I was taking my gloves off. I'd worked out what was happening and I wanted my hands free and I wanted to feel the air. You learn things from bare skin that a readout will never tell you. The cold came up my wrists in that specific bone-deep way you only get in dead, still, dry air. No wind. No moisture. Just heat leaving you in a straight line down. -31 and falling. I grew up in a place that hit that on a good week. My mother's heat exchange station sat 40 kilometers past the last inhabited grid point in the Siberian exclusion zone, and the working rule out there was simple: cold is not an enemy, cold is arithmetic. It takes heat out of things at a rate you can calculate, and once you can calculate it you can plan around it, and once you can plan around it, it's just weather. I've stripped a regulator housing barehanded at -40 in a whiteout because the alternative was 11 people freezing in the dark by morning. That was a Thursday. That was most Thursdays. So I stood there in their execution chamber, in the coldest room the Concordance could build, and I was fine. Not brave. Not defiant. Comfortable. And 40 meters away, the galaxy's most perfect killing machine was slowly, visibly, running out of steam. The screaming had stopped. The apex was moving in a wide, sloppy arc around the edge of the pit, snout down now instead of up, dragging its flank along the wall again. Every few meters it stopped and pressed its whole side against the stone for a moment before moving on. The magma seams along its back had gone from bright orange to a duller, deeper red. It wasn't stalking me. It was searching. Badly. Like a man who's lost his glasses looking for his glasses. I watched it do a full circuit of the arena and pass within 9 meters of me, 9 meters, close enough that I felt a wash of warmth come off it like an open oven door, and it kept going. Snout down. Never even turned. That's when I knew for certain. It couldn't find me, not because I was hidden, because I wasn't bright enough. The thing hunted by heat. In its own atmosphere, at 280 degrees ambient, a living body would blaze out of the ash haze like a lamp. But here, in a chamber deliberately chilled to punish me, my little 37 degrees of human warmth was a candle in a snowstorm. Diffuse. Smeared. Indistinguishable from a slightly warm rock. They'd built the perfect blindfold and put it on their own executioner. And the creature wasn't hunting meat at all. It was pressing its body against the walls looking for the one thing it actually needed, and not finding it, and getting slower. It wasn't a monster in that room. It was the only thing in that room that was genuinely, desperately in trouble. Then Vax made his mistake. He'd been watching the same arc I had, and he'd read it completely wrong. He saw a predator circling, drawing out the kill, performing. And he wanted the performance to land. His voice came down over the pit, and I could hear it, the crack in it, so small that only someone listening for it would catch it. The chamber is insufficiently cold, he announced. The creature's arrival must be unmistakable. Reduce ambient by 20 degrees. Somewhere above me, machinery engage. The frost line on the wall began, very slowly, to climb. And I put my gloves back on, because I finally had something to do, and I said, out loud, to a creature that could not possibly understand me, "Buddy, he is not helping you. The temperature drop hit in about 4 minutes. You could watch it happen. The frost line on the pit wall, which had been sitting at a steady 2 meters, started creeping upward, slow but visible, the way a tide comes in when you're not looking directly at it. My breath got denser. The sand underfoot went from soft to gritty, as whatever residual moisture was in it locked up. And the Volco's apex stopped walking. Not dramatically. It just stopped mid-arc, one heavy foreleg still lifted, and stood there like a machine waiting for an instruction that hadn't come. Then it set the foot down and lowered its whole chest to the sand. The magma seams along its flanks went from deep red to something closer to brown. Up in the galleries, 10,000 aliens made a sound I can only describe as satisfied. They thought it was crouching. They thought this was the part where it gathered itself to pounce. I'd seen an animal do that before, and it wasn't to pounce. Here's the thing about working outdoors in a place that kills people. You spend a lot of time around animals that are also trying not to die, and after enough years you stop seeing wild and tame as the categories that matter. The categories that matter are what does it need and is it getting it. There was a stray that used to come around the Norilsk station. Big gray thing, mostly dog, possibly not entirely. Every winter it would turn up at the compressor housing and lie against the vent, and every winter one of the new techs would panic and want to drive it off, because it was large and it had teeth, and it growled when you got close. It didn't want the techs. It didn't want the food scraps either, not really. It wanted the vent. My mother's rule was, before you decide what an animal is, watch what it walks toward. Not what it looks at, not what it makes noise at, what it walks toward. So I stood in an alien execution pit and I watched what the Volco's apex walked toward. It wasn't me. It had passed me at 9 meters and kept going. It walked toward the walls. Every time. It pressed its sight against stone, held it, moved on. It had spent 40 minutes doing a slow circuit of the room, and at no point had it gone for the largest warm object in it, which was standing in the open with its hands out. It was looking for a heat source it could lie against, and every wall it tried was colder than the last. The scream at the beginning hadn't been a hunting cry. I'd assumed it was. Everyone in that arena had assumed it was. It was a complaint. The behavior that sealed it happened about 6 minutes after the temperature drop. The apex, still low to the sand, extended one of the small folded arms from its chest, the mantis limbs, the ones I'd assumed were for holding prey, and began scraping at the volcanic grit in front of its snout. Not digging. Scraping. Short, repetitive, gathering strokes, pulling loose sand into a shallow heap in front of its own body. Then it laid its head on the heap. I actually laughed. Out loud. In an arena. Which, in hindsight, was the moment I lost any remaining sympathy from the crowd. Because I'd seen that too. Everything that lives in cold and can't generate enough of its own heat eventually learns the same trick. Reduce your surface area, get insulation between you and the ground, and wait. Dogs do it. Foxes do it. My mother's stray did it against the compressor vent. Human beings do it in survival training, and they teach it in the first week, and it is the single least glamorous thing a body can do. The galaxy's deadliest predator was building itself a pillow. I started walking toward it. I need to be clear that this was not bravery. Bravery is doing something dangerous because it needs doing. This was closer to arrogance. I had a hypothesis and I wanted to test it, and the cost of being wrong was extremely high, and I did it anyway because I've been doing this job for 40 years and I know what I know. Also, honestly, I was starting to feel bad for it. I walked in at an angle not straight on. Never approach anything straight on. Straight on is what predators do to prey and what challengers do to rivals, and both of those readings get you killed. Angled and slow reads is not a threat and not in a hurry. 11 meters. The snout came up. 9. It tracked me. I could see the pits along the flat of its face widening, the whole head rotating a few degrees to keep me centered. 7 meters. It made a sound. Low grinding, not the scream. More like a furnace turning over. At 5 meters I stopped, because it had lifted its head fully off the sand pile and I'd gotten my answer. It was interested in me. Mildly. The way you're interested in someone walking past your window. It was not hunting me. A hunting animal at 5 meters has already committed. This thing had its head up and its limbs folded, and it was doing the exact thing my mother's stray used to do when a tech got too close to the vent, assessing whether I was about to take away the only thing in the room worth having. And there wasn't anything in the room worth having. That was the whole problem. It had check. Yeah, I said. I know. It's freezing and everyone's yelling. Rough day. It made the furnace sound again. Above us, the arena had gone quiet in a new way. The first silence, when the apex came out, had been anticipation. This one was different. This was 10,000 people watching something they had no filing system for, a condemned human standing 5 meters from an apex, hands loose at his sides, having what appeared to be a conversation. And Vax broke. Not completely, not yet, but he broke enough to do the thing that arrogant men do when the script stops working. He tried to narrate his way back into control. The creature, he announced, and his voice was pitched slightly too loud, is savoring it. Nobody in the galleries made a sound. This is documented behavior. In prolonged engagements the apex will, and then he stopped, because down on the sand the apex had put its head back down on its little pile of gathered grit and closed the heat pits along one side of its snout. It had, functionally, decided I was not interesting enough to stay awake for. I heard something above me that I will treasure until I die. It was the sound of one alien somewhere in the lower galleries laughing. And then a second one. Vax's voice cut across it, and for the first time there was no ceremony in it at all, just a man giving an order because he'd run out of speech. Reduce ambient by 20 more degrees. And that is the moment I stopped finding it funny. Because I'd been doing arithmetic since the drop hatch opened, and the arithmetic had a floor. I was fine. I want to be honest about that. At -50 when I was uncomfortable, at -70 I'd have maybe 2 hours of useful function in that jumpsuit, and I'd have been unpleasant company, but I'd have been alive. Humans are absurd that way. We are not the strongest thing on any list, but we hold temperature like a stubborn old building. The apex wasn't going to be fine. It was a creature built for 280 degrees. It had been in a room at -31 for the better part of an hour, and the seams along its back, the ones that had been glowing bright orange when it walked out of the hatch, had faded to the color of old brick. It had stopped walking. It had stopped searching. It was lying on a pile of sand it had scraped together with its own hands, conserving what it had left. They hadn't sent a monster in to kill me. They'd sent a freezing animal into a cold room, and were now, in front of 10,000 cheering witnesses, slowly killing it to make a point about how dangerous it was. I stood there for a second with that. Then I reached into the thigh pocket of my jumpsuit, the deep one, the one nobody had checked, because it doesn't look like a pocket unless you've worn the suit, and my hand closed around 40 years of habit. Because here is the thing about terraforming technicians. We do not go anywhere without a heater. The thing I pulled out of my pocket was not a weapon. I want to be very clear about that, because the Concordance spent 4 months afterward insisting it was, and there are still people in 3 systems who believe I smuggled a device into that arena. It was a Kessler pattern thermal emitter, handheld, about the size of a large thermos, scuffed orange and gray casing with the stencil worn down to Kessler IND. Rubberized grip. Cracked readout. 2 dents in the housing, one from a dropped scaffold plate and one I have never been able to account for. It puts out a focused cone of heat at about 600 watts and it exists so that a technician can thaw a frozen seal, warm a coupling before torquing it, or keep their hands working in weather that wants them not to. Every terraforming tech alive carries one. It's not equipment. It's pocket lint. It's the thing that's been in the suit, so long you forget it's there, like a coin in a coat you haven't worn since last winter. Nobody searched for it because nobody on that station could imagine a reason a condemned prisoner would want to make something warmer. I thumbed the wheel. The emitter head went from dead gray to dull red, and a thin curl of warmth came off it into the freezing air. 5 meters away, the apex lifted its head off the sand. Every heat pit on that snout opened at once. I've never seen an animal go from off to on like that. 1 second it was a large dying thing conserving itself on a pile of grit, and the next its whole head was up and rotating and every pit along that broad flat face was flared wide and pointed directly at my right hand. The furnace sound came back. Louder. And the seams along its back went from old brick to orange in about 2 seconds, like someone had blown on a coal. Now, here is where a braver man would have held onto it. I did not hold onto it. I've been around animals long enough to know that the single fastest way to get hurt is to be standing between something desperate and the thing it's desperate for. The dog doesn't bite you because it hates you. It bites you because you are in the way of the vent, and it has stopped being able to think about anything else. So I did the only intelligent thing available. I got out of the way. I turned, took 3 steps, and underhanded the emitter across the pit. A good throw, 40 meters, the kind you learn from a lifetime of tossing tools to somebody on the far side of a gantry. It arced up, turning over, catching pale blue arena light on one face and its own dull red glow on the other. And 10,000 aliens watched the galaxy's deadliest predator ignore a live human being completely and go after a tool. It moved fast. That was the part that told me I'd read it right, and also the part that put a cold weight in my stomach. Because up until that moment I'd been working on inference, behavior, posture, the sand pile, the wall pressing. Reasonable, but inference. The speed was proof. That thing had been slow for an hour, dragging, stopping, lying down, and the instant there was 600 watts on the far side of the room, it came off that sand like something 20 years younger, 4 heavy legs throwing black grit in a wave, covering 40 meters in a span of time I would rather not think about too hard. It hadn't been weak. It had been saving. It reached the emitter about a second after the emitter reached the ground, and it did not eat it, and it did not smash it. It put its snout down over the thing, held there, and made a sound that came up through the sand and into the soles of my boots. Then it curled. 4 legs folded in, tail came around. The whole enormous armored body coiled into a tight ring with the little glowing tool at the center of it, and the 2 mantis' arms came out and pulled loose sand up against its own flank, banking it, the way you'd pull a blanket up. And it went quiet. Not dead quiet. A deep, low, rhythmic thrum, felt more than heard, the sound of an engine that has finally been allowed to idle. The magma seams along its back came up to a steady, contented orange. It had been in that arena for 1 hour and 11 minutes, and this was the first time it had stopped moving because it wanted to. I have never heard a silence like the one that followed. 10,000 people. A room built to amplify screaming. And nothing. No cheering. No commentary. Somebody's ceremonial staff clattered off a gallery rail somewhere high up on the eastern tier, and you could hear every individual bounce. I stood 40 meters away with my hands back in my pockets, and I looked up at the box. Vax was still standing, chin still up, because that gold collar frame doesn't let it go anywhere else. But his hands had come apart. Those long steepled fingers had unlaced and were just hanging there at his sides, and all 4 of his eyes were fixed on the sleeping animal in the middle of his execution pit. That is not, he said, what it does. He wasn't addressing the galleries. He wasn't addressing me. He was saying it out loud to the room, the way you read a sentence twice because it didn't parse the first time. It has never, in 240 proceedings, it has never. Yeah, I called up. You mentioned 240 for 240. He looked down at me. I want to say I felt triumphant. Mostly I felt tired, and my hands were getting cold now that I'd thrown away the only heat in the building. What did you do to it? Not a question. Not really. A demand shaped like one. Nothing, I said. That's the part you're going to have trouble with. I didn't do anything to it. I gave it what it wanted. It wants prey. It wants to be warm. I gestured at the ring of sleeping armor at the center of his arena. That animal is from a world at 280 degrees. You put it in a room at -31. Then when it got sluggish, you dropped it another 20. Then you were about to drop it 20 more. I let that sit. It never hunted me. It couldn't even find me. I'm 37 degrees in a freezer. I'm a warm rock. It spent an hour trying to lie against your walls, because your walls were the closest thing to a heat source it could find, and your walls are made of stone in a chamber you refrigerated on purpose. Somewhere in the lower galleries, one voice said something short and appalled. Then several more. It was dying, I said. You've been running these 240 times, and every single one of those, that animal came out of that hatch freezing to death and desperate, and something warm and panicking ran at it, and got eaten, and you all wrote down that it was a monster. I looked at the sleeping thing. It's not a monster. It's cold. It's been cold for 240 proceedings. Vax's voice, when it came, had lost the ceremony entirely. You are a Deathworlder. Yeah. Your species declares itself forged by hardship. You claim your homeworld tests you. You submit this to the concordance as justification for. His hand moved, a small, brittle gesture at the whole arena, this tolerance. This absence of fear. Sure. And your response to the apex predator of a burning world, he said, was to give it a heater. I thought about it. It's not really about the heater, I said. It's that I've met it before. You have never. Not it. Something like it. I shrugged inside the jumpsuit. Big, cold, loud when you get close. Lies against the machinery because the machinery's the warmest thing around. We've got about 900 of those on my continent alone. You leave a vent open and something turns up and sleeps by it. That's not a Death World thing. That's a Tuesday thing. Vax stared down at me. It's a stray, I said. You've been executing people with a stray. That's when the first section of the galleries stood up. I want to be honest, for about 4 seconds I thought they were going to kill me. 10,000 people rising at once in a stone amphitheater sounds exactly like the beginning of something bad. They weren't standing to riot. They were standing to see. The lower tiers were leaning over the rails, 3 and 4 deep, craning to get a look at the thing coiled around a 2-credit industrial tool in the middle of the pit, breathing slow, banked in its own little wall of sand. And someone up there, I never found out who, and I've stopped trying, said the word that ended the Concordance's arena program. They said "oh." Just that. Just a small, flat, embarrassed syllable in a room designed for screaming. 10,000 people looked at their monster and finally, after 240 proceedings, actually saw it. Down in the pit, the apex made a soft grinding noise, uncurled one heavy foreleg, and rolled slightly so that more of its underside was toward the emitter. Then it went back to sleep. And I stood there in the cold with my hands in my empty pockets, watching 10,000 aliens have a species-wide crisis of conscience, and thought, I really wish I hadn't thrown away my only heater. They didn't know how to end it. That's the part nobody puts in the retellings. Everyone wants the moment where the council falls silent and the monster goes to sleep, and then they want to cut to me walking out through a corridor of stunned aliens while something triumphant plays. What actually happened is that 10,000 people sat in a freezing amphitheater for 40 minutes arguing about procedure. Because there was no procedure, the arena had exactly 2 outcomes on file: the condemned dies, which had happened 240 times, or the condemned survives the full cycle, which had never happened and therefore had a rule attached to it that nobody had ever read. Somebody eventually read it. It said that a condemned who survives the proceeding is remanded to the arbiter's judgment. Which meant it was Vax's call. And Vax was standing on his stone box with his hands hanging at his sides, looking down at a sleeping animal, having what I can only describe as the worst afternoon of his professional life. Meanwhile, I was getting genuinely cold. My hands were in my armpits inside the jumpsuit. The frost line had climbed past 4 meters and stopped, because somebody up there had finally had the sense to shut off the chillers. Eventually Vax spoke, and his voice had gone flat and careful, like a man reading from a document he doesn't trust. Retrieve the human. Nobody move. Retrieve the... Yeah, about that, I called up. You're going to have a problem. The problem was that the apex had woken up. Not the alarming kind of waking up. It had raised its head off the coil, pits flaring, and swept the room once. And then it had done the thing that I had, in fairness, completely failed to anticipate. It had gotten up, walked 40 meters across the pit carrying my thermal emitter delicately in its 2 little mantis arms like a waiter with a full tray, set it down at my feet, and lain down on top of my boots. All 6 tons of it. Okay, I said. It made the furnace noise. Look, I understood the logic immediately. I was the source. In its head, the sequence went, cold room, cold room, cold room. The large slow thing produced warmth. It didn't know about switches. It didn't know about batteries. It knew that heat had come out of me, and it was going to stay near me in case more happened. That is exactly, precisely how a stray works. You feed it once and it doesn't think that was a nice person, it thinks food comes out of that. The recovery team came in through the lower hatch in full thermal armor with restraint poles. The apex lifted its head, made a sound like a foundry, and every one of them stopped in the doorway. I said, don't. They looked up at the box. The box said nothing. It's not defending territory, it's defending a heat source, and right now it thinks that's me and the emitter. I shifted my weight. Couldn't. 6 tons. If you come at it with poles it will fight you, and you will lose, and then you'll have to kill it, and then you'll have killed the only thing your entire justice system was built on. Long pause. So what do you suggest, said Vax, and I swear there was something almost human in it. Exhaustion, maybe. Turn the heat on, I said. In the pit. Bring it up to 280 and open the hatch. That chamber has never been heated. Yeah, I noticed. It took them 3 hours to work out how to make their execution chamber warm. The irony was not lost on anyone. They had cooling infrastructure that could drop a stone amphitheater to -51 in under 10 minutes, and to raise the temperature they had to bring in 6 portable industrial units from a shipyard 2 levels down and run cable through a service corridor that hadn't been opened in a decade. I spent those 3 hours sitting on the sand with an apex predator's head across my lap. I don't have a good way to describe the weight. Think of a car engine that's warm and breathing. The armor plating was rough and dry and hot enough to be uncomfortable through the jumpsuit, which after 2 hours in a freezer was the single most pleasant sensation of my adult life. It thrummed. Every few minutes it would shove the snout further into my stomach, and I would push it back 6 inches, and it would immediately shove it in again. Around hour 2, somebody in the lower gallery, one of the plain gray-robed ones, no ceremonial collar, some clerk or attendant, worked up the nerve to lean over the rail and shout down at me. Does it hurt? The nuzzling? No, it's just heavy. A pause. Then, why does it do that? And I looked up at 10,000 people who had watched this animal for 240 proceedings and had never once thought to ask that question, and I gave them the honest answer. Because it's an animal and you're the only company it's got. Vax came down to the pit floor at hour 3. I'll give him credit for that. He didn't have to. He could have stayed on his box and issued instructions and preserved the geometry of the thing, and instead he came down a service stair in those heavy layered robes and walked out onto the black sand and stood about 8 meters away with his hands folded, looking at the two of us. Up close he was smaller than he looked from the floor. They all were. I have reviewed the telemetry, he said. Your physiological readings were accurate. The instrument was not faulty. A pause. I have ordered that noted in the record. That's decent of you. It is not decency. It is correction. He said it sharply, and then something went out of his shoulders. There is a difference, and I would prefer it be recorded properly. The apex made a noise and shifted, and Vax flinched hard enough that the gold collar frame clicked against his throat. 6 tons of armored death rolling over will do that. It is asleep, he said. Not to me. To himself. Yeah. On a human. Warm human. You are 37 degrees. And everything else in here is minus 51. I scratched at the plating between 2 seams, which it had made extremely clear it enjoyed. That's the whole thing, Arbiter. That's the entire trick. There isn't a second part. He was quiet for a while. Then he said the thing I'd been waiting for since the drop hatch opened, and he said it slowly, like a man stepping onto ice. Your species does this. Does what? This. That brittle gesture again, at the animal, at me, at the sand. This is not a singular act. You have a practice. Ah. I nodded. Yeah. We do. How many? How many what? How many species, said High Arbiter Vax, have your people done this to? I actually had to think about it. Depends how you count, I said. Formally domesticated, top of my head, dogs, cats, horses, cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, chickens, ducks, geese, camels, llamas, rabbits, bees. Bees is a weird one. Silkworms. Yaks. Reindeer sort of. Falcons. But that's more of an arrangement than a domestication. The falcon's very clear that it's temporary. I shrugged. 30, 40? Call it 40. 40. Give or take. And the predators. His voice had gone very quiet. Among these 40, the apex ones. That's the first one we did, I said. Dogs. 40,000 years back, give or take. Wolves, apex predator, pack hunter, roughly your build, would absolutely take a person down if it wanted to. We started leaving food at the edge of camp because the bold ones came closer to the fire. I paused. For the warmth mostly. Same as this. And now? Now they sleep on the bed and we buy them little coats when it's cold out. Vax did not say anything for a long moment. You reduced an apex predator, he said, to an animal that requires a coat. We didn't reduce anything. We just kept being warm at it for 400 generations. I shifted the enormous head on my lap. That's not a weapon, Arbiter. That's just what happens when a species is too stubborn to be scared of things and too soft to leave them outside. And that was the beat where he finally, visibly gave up. All 4 eyes closed. The long fingers came up and pressed against the smooth dome of his skull. We invited you into the Concordance, he said, because we believed you were dangerous. We are. You are not dangerous. You are. He searched for it, and I watched a 7-foot hyperlogical alien fail to find a word in his own language and have to borrow one of ours. You are sentimental. On an industrial scale. That's the most accurate thing anyone in this system has ever said about us. They got the pit up to 261 degrees by the 4th hour, which was close enough. I know exactly when it hit, because the animal on my legs lifted its head, went utterly still, and then made a noise I hadn't heard from it before, higher, shorter, and if I'm being unprofessional about it, delighted. Every seam along its back flared bright orange. It got up off me in one motion, shook itself like a wet dog, sending black grit across half the arena floor, and stood there in the heat with its snout up and all its pits wide open. Then it turned around, came back, and shoved its head into my chest one more time. Yeah, I said. Go on. It went 40 meters into the open hatch and gone. I got up off the sand, which took a minute, because my legs had been under a domestic animal the size of a bus for 3 hours and had opinions about it. My thermal emitter was still lying where it had put it, dented, scuffed, faintly warm, one small new gouge in the casing from a claw. I picked it up and put it back in my thigh pocket, where it lives. They dropped the charges. All of them. There was a formal proceeding and a lot of language, and I understood approximately half of it, but the shape of it was, the concordance had been operating a judicial instrument based on a factual error for 240 proceedings, and continuing to do so was no longer possible now that 10,000 witnesses had watched a retired technician demonstrate the error, by taking a nap with it. The arena program was suspended. The Apex, they still call it the Apex, officially, nobody has managed to make a new namesake, was relocated to a heated enclosure on the shipyard level with a permanent thermal source, which cost them a not insignificant amount of money, and which Vax personally signed the requisition for. I've been back twice. It remembers me. It remembers the emitter, more accurately, but I've made peace with that. Vax and I are, I would say, on speaking terms. He sends me an annual communication on the anniversary. It is extremely formal and contains no warmth whatsoever, and I have kept every single one. The last thing. When they finally walked me out of processing, new clothes, all my property returned, 6 hours after the drop hatch opened, a clerk in plain gray robes handed me a battered steel thermos with a strip of vulcanized tape around the lid. I checked it. Still sealed. Still, against all odds, faintly warm, because it's a good thermos and it cost me 4 days' wages in 2061 and I have never once regretted it. I unscrewed the lid and poured a cup right there in the corridor, in front of the clerk, and the guards, and High Arbiter Vax of the Concordance, who had come down personally to observe my release and who watched this entire operation with an expression of total incomprehension. That is what you wanted, he said, throughout. That is what you asked for in the cell. Yep. You were sentenced to death. I agreed, and I took the first mouthful, and it was still hot, and it was the best cup of coffee I have ever had in my life. Death's a big problem, I said. Cold coffee's a small problem. You can only fix one of those. I finished the cup. And that, more or less, is how humanity got its reputation in this arm of the galaxy, not as the species that survives death worlds, but as the species you absolutely do not leave alone with your monsters, because we will feed them, and name them, and by the third visit we will have bought them a coat.